you all been? Hope everything's been okay. If you're in the UK, I hope you were able to find some entertainment in any way, shape or form in this kind of thing. Well, in case you were wondering what this image was, hey up. Managed to coax him out from underneath the fridge. Did find some cheese in the end, which he's nibbling away. It's the last bit of cheese and he's eating it. You are a selfish little rat. Yes, of course. He's always selfish. Mind you, being selfish and rude can sometimes be a very sticky situation. I know a story about someone who was very rude and very selfish. He had a very sticky situation, so please be warned, this should not be watched by children. I will definitely note this one as not to be watched by kids. Maybe you shouldn't listen either. He's not listening anyway. So, the story is set in a bakery in New York. This bakery was very, very famous. It made the top bread in the world, and the top desserts too. I certainly would have loved a Belgian bun from that place. But this was made famous because of one person. His name was Boris. Boris was a butcher. Boris worked long and hard throughout his days. He made sure that every single food was cooked to perfection. He loved his bread. He loved working there. He loved being a baker. And for a time, he loved working at the place where he worked. The baker was owned by Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell was always very nice and polite. He adored Boris. He knew that without Boris, the business would not be complete. Sadly, Mr. Mitchell suffered a heart attack and died less than 2 years from when this story starts. His son, Mr. Mitchell Jr., took over, and the place, well, it's never been the same. You see, Mitchell Jr. only believed in being able to make money. He didn't care about how it was done. He didn't care about the bread. He didn't care about the people. He threatened to fire Boris 4 times before this story started. Boris, of course, was too much of a good baker to be turned away. Any other bakery would have loved him. In fact, a lot of bakeries had even offered him a job after Mitchell died. But Boris was very loyal and refused to work anywhere else. So, on this particular day, Boris was working as usual in the bakery. He was making his bread as per usual and testing the oven to make sure it was safe. He wasn't expecting anything. He wasn't really expecting any customers. It had been practically quiet all day, and he was on his 3rd tray of loaf of bread. He was a wise man. He knew that at about 6 o'clock, the time was about 4 o'clock, people would come rushing in to buy their bread from work. He knew. He had experience. So he was preparing for the bread rush, as he nicknamed it. As Boris pulled the last tray of bread out of the oven, he heard the sound he dreaded. It was the sound of laughter. It was, of course, Boris. It was, of course, Boris's new boss, Mitchell Jr. And Mitchell's 3rd, yes, I'm telling the truth, his 3rd wife. He'd had many girlfriends, but this was his 3rd wife. As usual, he pranced around, criticising Boris and telling him that the bread should be square when it was meant to be round and all of that. But today seemed a bit unusual. He wasn't as critical as he originally was. He made the odd comment about the odd bread, and usually he made a comment about the cakes that Boris made for special occasions like weddings and parties. But today he seemed to stay away from this. As Boris continued to work, Mitchell asked his wife to leave the room. His wife laughed and wandered off, leaving Boris at the mercy of Mitchell. It was then that Mitchell Jr. smiled. Now, Boris knew better than to judge a person, but he knew when Mitchell Jr. smiled, there was something odd going on. "How can I help you, Mr. Mitchell?" asked Boris. Mitchell Jr. scoffed and picked up a loaf of bread. "You are the best baker in town, Boris," he said. Now Boris knew something was wrong. "Yes, thank you, sir," he said. Mitchell just waved his thank you away. "I need a cake, Boris. The best cake you've ever made, probably big enough to feed a family of 30, if you don't mind. And I need it by yesterday." Now Boris didn't mind cooking a cake by yesterday. He could cook anything. "Very well, sir," he said. When would you like this cake to be?" Sorry, sir, I believe you said. When was, who is it for?" "It is for Mr. Daniel Johnson." This made Boris freeze. Daniel Johnson was the top gangster to ever roam New York. Everybody knew about Johnson, and everybody feared him. But Boris held his cool. "Is it for his birthday?" he asked. Mitchell laughed. No, I just did a favour for Johnson all those years ago, and we're celebrating. No, just get the cake done, and let me know when it's finished, and I'll come and pick it up." "Very well, sir," said Boris. "That's what I like about you, Boris," he said. "Never worrying, never paying," and he sneered at the next comment, "and never badgering for a raise." Boris wasn't really entitled to money. In fact, he didn't really care about it. As long as he was baking, he didn't care what he was doing or where he was doing it. So that day, Boris started on the cake. He'd already made the first layer. Pure chocolate cake, smouldering in chocolate icing. He was going to enjoy this. He loved baking, every time. Now, in all fairness, if there was one person he hated more than Mitchell, it was Johnson himself. But a customer was a customer, so Boris made ready the second layer and turned up the oven, having let it cool from the first layer. That was the key to baking, apparently. As he turned the oven up to start getting to heat up, he heard the pipes creak. The pipes were creaking and groaning. Boris would confess later he'd never heard those pipes croon like that before. However, it wasn't unusual for the metal in the pipes, and indeed the metal in the oven, to expand, so at first he dismissed it, thinking it was just that. He was just making another batch to put in the layer of cake. It was a big tray that he was having to make, and had just wandered to the oven to check when he heard the sound again. Now he was scared. He definitely had never heard the pipes do that before, and he'd been there for years. The pipes sounded like they were screaming. A bit nervous and a bit afraid, he pulled the oven door down and looked inside. At first it was steamy and he couldn't really see anything, and it was certainly hot, and the fire was certainly rounding up properly. It was rounding up so properly that there appeared to be a face in the flame. He blinked and looked again. No, there definitely was a face, and it was screaming. It was screaming the sound of the pipes, and it was getting louder. The face looked like it was in pain, distorted, and a little bit angry as well. He was frightened. He didn't know what to do. He shut the oven door and ran out into the main shop. Now that he'd seen what he'd seen, he wasn't confident with going back in. He was no denial of what he saw, and being a suspicious man, he was prepared to believe anything. Mitchell Jr. arrived about a good 20 minutes after what this had happened. He found Boris nervously pacing the shop floor. "What's the matter, Boris?" he asked. Why are you not in the kitchen baking my cake?" "I'm sorry, sir," said Boris, now very nervous. "I can't go back and do your cake." "Why? What's wrong?" "Sir, I know you're not going to believe me, but there was a devil in the oven." Of course, Mitchell snorted. "A devil in the oven? What, is hell not hot enough for him?" Boris looked ashamed. He knew it sounded crazy, but he also knew definitely what he'd seen. "Boris, I don't want no more of this madness. I want you to go back into that kitchen and cook me that cake right now." "I'm sorry, sir," said Boris, too afraid to go back into the kitchen. "I'm afraid I refuse." This angered Mitchell. With a declare that he was going to cook the cake himself, he forced Boris out of the shop door and down the road, throwing his bag behind him. Boris had been fired. He didn't know what to tell his wife when he got home, but he needed an excuse, and he couldn't think of one. When he got home, he told his wife what had happened, ashamed and angry. His wife was a little bit more understanding, though. "The devil in the oven? It's an omen, Boris. You know that as well as I do." "It doesn't matter, Nancy," said Boris. "What matters now is that I've been fired and there's nothing more I can do." "Oh, Boris, don't be silly," said Nancy, comforting him. "Everything will be all right. You know that as well as I do. I just got to touch the screen, Ratty. Promise you'll have the cheese in a minute." There we go. Sorry about that, guys. "You're the greatest baker in New York. You'll get a job real soon." A few minutes later, Boris was looking through the newspaper when he spotted an article that made his blood run cold. He called his wife Nancy into the kitchen to make sure that he'd seen exactly what he'd seen. The article was about the murder of the second top gangster in the history of the world, Mr. Jackson. Mr. Jackson had been killed in a car bomb just a few yards outside of the courts. He'd just come from a court case. The suspect had always been Mr. Johnson and an associate, but no one knew who the associate was. However, the picture of Mr. Jackson made Boris's spine chill. It was him. It was the man he'd seen screaming in the oven. There was no doubt about it. He recognised the face. And he was scared. What did this mean? Why was Mr. Jackson's face screaming in the oven that he'd worked with for many years? It was definitely an omen. Round about the same time, just as he was going through this with Nancy, the phone rang. Nancy promptly answered it. At first, she didn't seem to be that scared. It was probably a friend. But then her voice became concerned. She ran into the living room and shouted at Boris. "Boris! Janet was on the phone. There's a fire coming outside from the outside of the bakery." Well, Boris wasn't going to let his old employee's place burn to the ground. He ran as quickly as he could to the shop, Nancy assuring Janet that he would be there very shortly. Janet had phoned to see if Boris was still in the building when the fire had started, just to let you know. Boris arrived about a good 10 minutes and ran straight into the kitchen. Smoke was everywhere. It was certainly boiling hot, and there was no sign of Mitchell Jr. He'd assumed Mitchell had made it out, but it was weird. There hadn't been that much in the way of an improvement to the cake, although the second tray had disappeared. What was going on? He knew Mitchell couldn't cook, but surely he'd know how to make a cake. Oh, sorry, Ray. The rat... You're getting dusty, Retty. You need a wash. Back to eating. Boris noticed that the smoke was coming from the oven and quickly yanked the door open. He couldn't think straight. He didn't know what to do. But the second he opened the oven, all fear took over his face and the colour drained from him. There, resting inside the cake of the second tray that had risen from the second tray, was Mitchell Jr., dead. It later Boris was never charged with the murder. He was acquitted. After all, Nancy and many other witnesses could declare that Boris was nowhere near the shops when it happened. However, no one else seemed to be near the shop when it happened as well. 4 years later, it conspired that Mitchell Jr. had helped Mr. Johnson plant the car bomb underneath Jackson's car. Maybe that was the party that they were preparing for. I'm not too sure myself, but it sounds like a pretty good story. You alright? You almost done with the cheese? Yeah? I think it's time to get this little nipper to bed. Although I've been told the story, I'm now wondering, cheese, dreams, nightmares, might not have been a good idea. Not that he cares. You gonna say goodbye? Good boy. Now go back to your cheese. Go on, go back to your cheese. Well, from Randy and me, we're going to wish you a good night, and I hope tomorrow brings you many, many wonderful things. Let me know what kind of things you're planning to do during the isolation. And I hope to have a good day too. Well, I'll see you around, my friends. Take care. See you around.